Hello, and welcome to Red Dragon Gaming. As promised, here in May, we're going to talk about role-playing games. This month, we're talking about the granddaddy of them all, Dungeons & Dragons. As far as I know, Dungeons & Dragons is the original role-playing game. It invented the entire, well, not necessarily the concept, but at least the entire game genre. It comes from old war games, still popular today, things like Warhammer, and that came after Dungeons & Dragons, but a lot of people used to take miniatures, just like you would in Warhammer, and move them around a battlefield, reenacting World War II battles, Civil War battles, other random historical battles that these people had heard about. One of the things they did in the historical battles was they reenacted them as close to historically accurate as everybody knew who was playing. So there wasn't really a winner, there wasn't really a loser, there wasn't really strategy involved because you were, just kind of playing out something that happened in history. So somewhere along the lines, Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, some other friends of theirs came up with this idea of taking that, only instead of it being about entire armies, they made it about individual soldiers, basically, and they told individual soldiers stories. And they paired that up with the idea of a fantasy world, a Tolkien-esque, Lord of the Rings style fantasy world, and bam, Dungeons & Dragons. You, the player, in role-playing games in general, in Dungeons & Dragons specifically, are a member of a party. You and all of your friends are adventurers. You travel the countryside, fighting evil, righting wrongs, hoarding treasure, getting gold to spend in taverns in celebration of your accomplishments, buying new equipment, getting magical weapons, killing evil wizards, and, of course, adventuring into dungeons and fighting dragons. There are all kinds of monsters in the game, all kinds of ways to play. Dungeons & Dragons is officially on the 5th edition. That is the books you see here. Those are for the current edition of the game, which is called the 5th edition. It is technically not the 5th. It's the 6th, 7th, 8th, depending on how you want to count it. There for a while in the 80s, there were actually 2 editions of Dungeons & Dragons at the same time. There was Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which is where the numbering comes from. There was Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, all the way up to 5th. But at the same time, there was the basic Dungeons & Dragons system, which more closely resembled the original rules. So anyway, it's the 5th edition. That's what everybody knows it by. That's what everybody calls it. So if you want to be understood, you call it the 5th edition. In rules, because the basic concept of Dungeons & Dragons is all about make-believe. You are pretending to be adventurers. You're pretending to be an elf with a longbow, and you're shooting a dragon from 200 yards away. And as far as rules are concerned, you don't necessarily need them, but of course, we are here talking about the rules. That is what separates each individual game, is the rule sets. The general concept is going to stay the same. And in the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, you are more of a classic Tolkien-esque still, nothing really out there in the terms of things. You don't get to be a dragon, or you don't get to be a illithid, you don't get to be a beholder, you don't get to be anything super out there. You are an elf, a dwarf, a halfling. You're a cleric, you're a fighter. And all the rules do is they tell you, they determine random outcomes. So that way there's a little fairness to the game. You're up fighting an orc, and if anybody, I'm sure everybody has done this at some point in time in their life as a kid, when your buddies were playing make-believe in the backyard, and you said, "I shoot you and you're dead," and your friend's like, "No, I had a magic shield that made me impervious," and you were like, "Aha, but I have the secret weapon that shoots through your impervious shield," and it just goes on and on like that because neither side wanted to lose. To prevent that in Dungeons & Dragons, to give it a little bit of a direction, there are rules. You roll dice. There's a number of different dice. You roll them to get different outcomes. Dungeons & Dragons is based upon basically a D20 system. That's a phrase coined for 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. They call that the D20 system. And what that means is most random results are determined by the roll of a 20-sided die, otherwise known as a D20. So you roll that, it determines the random outcome, and then the other dice from there determine damage or stuff like that. So first you roll the D20 in almost every situation, and then you'll roll something else to see what the results are once you've determined whether or not there is a result to roll for from that D20 roll. There are other styles of system out there. Some don't use dice at all. Some use playing cards. All sorts of stuff like that. Dungeons & Dragons, D20. You got 4-sided, 6-sided, 8-sided, 10-sided, 12-sided, and 100-sided dice to add to that to give you additional dice to roll, but the main die you're going to roll is your D20. You got your miniatures. You do not need miniatures. You can use them, however. They make it easier to visualize what's going on. But if you don't want to use them, in the 5th edition rules, you do not have to. In fact, the 5th edition rules assumes you are not. None of the rules are based upon anything going on visually. Previous editions of the rules have dabbled in, okay, you have the minis out. You can use them to determine whether or not you're hiding behind a wall sufficiently to have cover, or whether or not you can even see the bad guy. Or 5th edition assumes you aren't using minis, and therefore everything takes place in what they refer to as the theater of the mind, where you and your friends are just sitting around imagining what is being described. The dungeon master, who is the impartial judge, the rule keeper, the lore keeper, the storyteller of the game, he's describing what you see, and everybody just sits there and imagines it. So you need a very good dungeon master to describe these scenes well, so everybody can picture them in their heads. And the dungeon master says, you are on the other side of a tavern. The tavern is 50 foot wide. The front door gets kicked open, and a guy levels a crossbow at you and shoots it. There is no looking at the table to be like, okay, let's see here. This patron's in the way, and this patron's in the way, and okay, so I'm not going to get hit. The crossbow bolt's going to shoot other people. You don't know that unless the dungeon master specifically told you that, because once again, the assumption is no miniatures involved. But they do make things easier to visualize, especially when combat gets complicated. A bunch of people are moving around. So if the dungeon master wants, if the players want, they can take out the miniatures, put them on a battle mat like I have here. This is a dry erase mat. You just take dry erase expo markers, draw on it. I've seen people who create maps on a computer, print them off, assemble them on the table. Wizards of the Coast, I know back in the day, used to produce what they called dungeon tiles. They were high gloss cardboard tiles with all sorts of dungeon features drawn on them, bookcases, hallways, parts of rooms, and you could assemble them together to make a room on the battlefield. On the fly, just dig through a drawer of them next to the table as the dungeon master, throw them out, bam, you got yourself a room. I think Wizards of the Coast has started doing that again, or at the very least they've partnered with somebody to do that again here recently for 5th edition. We will have all of that stuff available. I don't know where these dry erase tiles came from, so probably not those, but there are wet erase mats where you use like an overhead erase marker, get a little water on a towel, wipe it up, cleans up nicely. We'll have some of those in the store. The rule books, of course, we'll have in the store. The miniatures we'll have in the store. Anything you might want for the game we'll have in the store. I do know there's other accessories that I don't own. Dungeon Master screens, all sorts of cool stuff that you can get for the game. And as much of it as we can carry, as much of it as we think we'll sell, we will have in the store. And if we can order it in for you and you want it, let us know. We'll order it in for you. But yeah, so Dungeons & Dragons is the granddaddy. It invented the game. The 5th edition rules are pretty simple. Sticks to the classics for the most part, at least in the core material. It's nothing like back in the 2nd edition AD&D rules where they had 6 or 7 different worlds, and you see the Monster Manual here. That is there's only 2 of them. The Monster Manual and Volo's Guide to Monsters in the 5th edition. But back in second edition, they had 7, 8, 10 of them, little 10 pagers all the way up to like 300, 400 pagers. So yeah, fifth edition, very streamlined, very cut down, not a lot of extra rules, but a lot of room to add your own flavor, add your own interpretation, which is very much appreciated by the community. In previous editions, especially the fourth edition, a lot of people felt that the rules went too far. It was trying to regulate things that they did not need regulated. And I'm sure everybody was upset because they were not being regulated the way they wanted them regulated. I'm sure if the rules had followed, anybody who were using the rules that 4th edition used prior to that, they were like, what's the big deal? So they regulated something. I was already doing it that way. What do I care if that's the official rule now? But anybody who wasn't using that rule, they got upset. So 5th edition stepped back from that. Not as many rules. But, so that's Dungeons & Dragons. That's the introduction to role-playing. All throughout the month, we're going to talk about the different rule sets, and I will most likely just compare them to Dungeons & Dragons. Once again, this one started it. This one is the easiest, the most base, the least specialized game set. Other editions, other games, largely are based on the same concepts, and they just go all sorts of weird directions and do all sorts of weird, fun things. And we'll explore those, but we will once again talk about them probably in how they differ from Dungeons & Dragons. So if you want to get into Dungeons & Dragons, come on down to the store. We're going to be doing all sorts of role-playing events, Dungeons & Dragons encounters, assuming Wizards of the Coast still runs that. I don't even know. I got to look into that. If they're still running it, we'll be running it. If they're not, we'll probably run something else instead. We'll have some DMs come in. I know we're looking at getting some kids role-playing games going, find ourselves some really, really top-notch storyteller DMs to get kids super into role-playing, get them introduced, get them into the game in a way that only a really, really good DM can. We're looking for some people like that. And then, hey, parents, you want to go off on a date night? Bring your kids down. They can enjoy some role-playing, have a lot of fun. You can enjoy date night. Pick them up before it gets too late. Get them home to bed. They'll have some great stories to tell. A lot of cool role-playing stuff that we're going to be doing here. I know I love role-playing. Both of my partners love role-playing. Pretty much everybody I know loves role-playing. And I'm sure a lot of you guys love role-playing as well. So check in with us next week. Next week, we're going to shift gears just a little bit. Stick in the fantasy genre, but instead of Dungeons & Dragons, we're going to talk about Hackmaster. Dungeons & Dragons turned up to 11 is a good way to put it. So tune in next week. See that.